I've described how I wrote my most recent book, Perspective and Guidance for a Time of Deep Discord, because of great concern I feel about how, with issues of every sort, people today are dividing almost immediately into polar camps. Extreme polarization is setting neighbor against neighbor, creating distraction, gets in the way of addressing essential questions, and often very directly putting us at risk. After addressing causes with each chapter in the book, I illustrate how we might bring culturally mature perspective to one issue where divisiveness too often prevails. Bringing more systemic perspective to bigotry-related conversations like we find today with the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements most immediately brings attention to the importance of including the dimension of time in our thinking, of appreciating that the task at one moment may not be the same as at another. And in a particularly powerful way, it highlights the implications of understanding identity in more complete, more whole system ways. What creative systems theory and the concept of cultural maturity add to the current conversations about the rights and circumstances of minorities and women is enough ahead of how we tend to think of things that, at least immediately, it may not be that helpful. And it is sufficiently nuanced that a short piece can at best provide a glimpse. I wrote a whole book, The Evolution of Intimacy, that applies the theory to gender and love. But I argue that cultural maturity's contribution is key to eventually getting the place where real mutual respect and understanding becomes possible. Creative systems theory highlights how the task with bigotry and discrimination is of two sorts, each related to different chapters in the evolution of culture. The first step gives us equal rights, equal opportunity, and equal safety. The important recognition, if we are to get fully to where we need to go, is we best think of this first step as turning final pages in the modern age project. The task that's associated with the Bill of Rights. It could not be more important, and we must do everything possible to realize these critical goals. And the best of efforts effectively support doing so. But creative system argues that we can't stop there. Cultural maturity's changes engage a further kind of task. I've noted with previous episodes that when issues get polarized, neither side has yet to ask the hard question that ultimately needs to be addressed. The larger systemic question when it comes to questions of gender and race asks, how do we engage cultural life and realize identity in a way that holds the whole of who we are, that doesn't involve projection and denigration? Creative systems theory describes how the predicted result, if we fail to engage this second kind of task, ultimately becomes more polarization, not less. As with all the polarizing issues we've looked at, the larger question in the end challenges both the right and the left. I go into great depth in my writing as to just how it does. That it challenges the right is pretty clear-cut. It leaves no room for the kind of projection that makes others less. But the challenges to the left are ultimately as great. Because we can miss them, here I'll briefly note three things that change. First is how we stop assuming that equality means equivalence. With integrated meta-perspective, equality just as much translates into the ability to appreciate real difference. For example, with gender issues, the postmodern assumption is that success will produce analogous life circumstances for women and men, or anyone everywhere, irrespective of self-described gender or sexual orientation. In my book on the evolution of intimacy, I describe a startling study that shows that one of the results of Scandinavia's extremely liberal policies when it comes to workplace equality has been fewer rather than more women choosing to assume executive positions. It appears that given full freedom, men's and women's choices may not always be the same. We see a similar expansion of perspective when it comes to issues of race and ethnicity. In my book, Creative Systems Theory, I observe that we often find specific personality styles being more prevalent with different ethnic and racial groups. It's a similarly radical observation and controversial, but the patterns are consistent with what we tend to find with career choices and commonly observed gifts. The second change concerned what happens when we begin to step beyond projection and denigration. Certainly, the whole person identity challenge applies to bigotry. Bigotry involves projecting a denigrated part of ourselves onto another so that we can feel strong and superior. In the end, bigotry fails both the modern age task and the cultural maturities task. But it's important to appreciate that we also find projection today with the populist left when it comes to cultural maturity's more demanding agenda. We see this with the victim narratives that commonly define woke identity politics. Increasingly, we find thinking that assumes that if anybody feels pain or confronts inequality, the solution must lie in oppressors changing their behavior. Recognizing where victimization has taken place is critical to accurately writing history. But identifying as a victim, that's something else. That involves projecting one's authority onto someone else and making one's perceptions of the other's behavior the determiner of our well-being. In the end, projection, wherever we find it, increases polarization. And it also does something else that gets in the way of moving forward, whether we see it with bigotry or the victim narrative. Besides failing the task of whole person identity, it is also in the end disempowering. In each case, identity becomes dependent on the other. Without someone to diminish, the victimizer almost ceases to exist. But just as much without someone to perceive as the ultimate source of one's pain, the person who identifies with being the victim is left feeling aimless. In my book, Perception and Guidance for a Time of Deep Discord, I quote poet Toni Morrison with regard to the challenge of getting beyond the victim narrative and holding identity in its fullness when it comes to race. She speaks of the importance of writing without the white man's gaze. The third kind of change involves the ability for true mutual respect and appreciation. In On the Evolution of Intimacy, I describe a litmus test for success with these further steps when it comes to gender. While efforts that reflect only modern age achievements such as equal rights and equal opportunity get us part of the way, by themselves they do nothing to address the historical battle of the sexes. Indeed, they only exacerbate it, something which I would argue we are seeing today. Mutual understanding and respect requires the more complete, all the crayons in the box kind of identity that comes with cultural maturity's further changes. The same principle applies with the battles of identity politics more generally. If we want the results of our efforts to be the greatest mutual empowerment, understanding, and respect, we need more than advocacy as we tend to think of it. We need the further steps that come with culturally mature perspective. Engaging identity from cultural maturity's more complete vantage requires more of us, both personally and collectively. We can think of what it asks in terms of the various new capacities that I've listed in previous episodes. Whole person, whole system identity requires new responsibility for authority in our lives. It requires the willingness to gauge a world without the ready answers of times past, and thus a world with greater uncertainty and complexity. In addition, it requires that we accept limits, for example, to what others can be for us as other halves in our preferred narratives. And it requires, too, that we think in ways that include context. Certainly, temporal context. Failing to recognize the way that thinking has evolved blinds us to changes already made, which both gets in the way of solidifying those changes and also feeds the victim narrative. It also gets in the way of fully understanding further changes essential to our time. As reward for taking all of this on, we get a more full and complete cultural story and more vital and complete ways of being in the world. That gets beyond where we currently reside with identity politics on both the left and the right. But we need this further step eventually. In a recent interview, the interviewer challenged my lack of excitement when it comes to many current efforts with the observation that he had learned a lot from them. I agree that current advocacy efforts, both with regard to gender and race, even if they tend to stop short of being culturally mature, will ultimately be beneficial and in many ways of great benefit. But I remember thinking that there was little that I had personally learned from current efforts. Think tanks we had done at the Institute for Creative Development 25 years ago on gender and race went much further toward the nuance and complexity of thought we will need eventually. Again, we find our now familiar apparent paradox. When it comes to issues of oppression and bigotry, we need ultimately to think in more complex, demanding, and nuanced ways than in times past. Certainly that applies to the simple-minded behaviors of historical oppression, but ultimately applies also to those who have experienced oppression. And at the same time, what is being asked is ultimately straightforward, arguably common sense. We are being challenged to live more fully from the whole of who we are, both as individuals and in who we are together. Again, I appreciate your thoughts and observations and questions.